What if humanity's oldest written words were never meant to tell the beginning, but to warn us about the ending? What if the first civilization wasn't first of all, but the last survivors of something far older? Beneath the burning deserts of southern Iraq, where the horizon wavers like an ancient mirage, pieces of clay whisper of a time the world forgot. Each wedge-ship mark, carved by hands 5,000 years dead, still hums faintly with purpose, as though it were trying to save not just words, but memory itself. Before we drift too far into the ruins, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you're drawn to the kind of history that sleeps between myth and archaeology. And if you're still here, leave a comment telling me where you're listening from, and what time it is where you are. I'd like to imagine this story unfolding across time zones, carried softly into sleep. The story begins not with answers, but with dust. In the late 1800s, archaeologists digging near Uruk and Eridu dug up thousands of clay tablets. They expected primitive beginnings, hesitant scratches, trial and error, the slow crawl of human invention. What they found instead was a civilization that appeared already advanced. Mathematical systems, city grids, laws written in perfect sentences, and records of stars mapped with impossible precision. The Sumerians had arrived in history as if stepping out of the ruins of something older. There was no gradual evolution, no slow climb from stone to bronze. The earliest Sumerian cities, Eridu, Nippur, were not chaotic settlements. They were geometric, lined up with the stars, and built with irrigation systems that defied their supposed age. Their language appeared fully formed with no known parent tongue, a linguistic isolate as if it had been carried from somewhere else and set down. Whole. History prefers slow progress, one tool leading to the next. But Sumer shattered that rhythm. Its precision implied memory, not invention. Scholars have wrestled with this for over a century. How could the first civilization begin in full bloom? How could a people with no written ancestors suddenly produce star charts that match modern observations, use BASC 60 mathematics that still shapes our clocks today, and build temples aligned to celestial events? The deeper excavations went, the stranger it became. They wrote the kingship descended from heaven. The Sumerians themselves offered an answer that unsettles us even now. They wrote that kingship, knowledge, and order descended from heaven. They did not claim to invent civilization, only to restore it. One tablet found in Berlin carries a chilling inscription: "This is the restoration of what was before." Restoration. A word that changes everything. If the Sumerians were rebuilding, what exactly had been lost? And what did they know of the world before the flood? Imagine holding one of those tablets now. Imagine the clay still warm in your palm, its wedge-shaped impressions carrying the pulse of a hand that lived before every empire we know. Sometimes, if you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago, a pulse frozen in mud. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have been writing down the last surviving fragments of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps intention. Through those marks, they're recorded not just trade and taxes, but medicine, astronomy, and hymns to forgotten gods. One tablet from Nippur records the 584-day cycle of Venus, a feat confirmed only with modern telescopes. Another describes the paths of Jupiter and Mars. Others contain mathematical formulas that came before Pythagoras by 1,500 years. Artifacts show similar oddities. Bronze tools appear centuries before the Bronze Age. Cylindrical seals show mechanical devices. And then there's the strange object known as the Baghdad battery, which may have generated electricity 2,000 years before its time. And then there are the stories. The Sumerians spoke of a great deluge that ended an earlier world. The same story appears in Akkadian texts, in Hebrew scripture, in Hindu epics, even in Mesoamerican writings. Cultures separated by oceans, by mountains, by thousands of years, all remembering the same catastrophe. How could they all carry the same memory? Perhaps memory itself drifts like silt, settling wherever consciousness finds room. Or perhaps the ancients shared more than we allow ourselves to imagine. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins of Uruk, they expected crude beginnings. Instead, they found city walls stretching 6 miles, monumental temples aligned with celestial points, and beneath one ziggurat, a library of over 40,000 clay tablets. A civilization that documented itself in extraordinary detail, yet left us with more questions than answers. How did they learn so much so quickly? Where did their mathematics based on 60, not 10 come from? Why did they map the heavens with such familiarity, as though they were remembering rather than discovering? Different theories. Some researchers suggest that Sumer rose from centuries of forgotten developments, small settlements lost to erosion and flood. Others whisper that the Sumerians inherited their knowledge from an even earlier people, when erased by the catastrophes that ended the last ice age. And then there are those who read the tablets literally, that the gods who descended from the sky were not divine in the spiritual sense, but teachers, travelers, or perhaps remnants of a civilization that came before us altogether. But even the skeptics admit something strange. The Sumerian timeline doesn't fit. Civilizations aren't supposed to emerge fully structured. Yet here they did: agriculture, writing, law, music, medicine, all at once. The clay tablets don't show trial and error. They show refinement, as though what we call the birth of civilization was to them a rebuilding. Number this is the restoration of what was before. In the Museum of the Ancient Near East in Berlin, a small clay cylinder rests behind glass. The markings on its surface describe the building of a temple in honor of Inanna, the goddess of love and war. But among the dedication lines, one sentence stands out. This is the restoration of what was before. Restoration. A word that implies memory, not invention. It's a quiet confession that even the Sumerians saw themselves as heirs to something older. Sometimes when you look closely at these artifacts, you notice fingerprints pressed into the clay before it dried, the print of a scribe who may have lived 6,000 years ago. And if you trace that ridge with your eyes, you realize those hands might have written down the last surviving fragments of an age erased by flood, time, or perhaps intention. The silence between those lines feels heavy, as if something vast had been taken away, the same way a missing note can haunt an entire song, the same way a lost memory hovers at the edge of sleep. Maybe that's why these stories still whisper to us. They remind us that what we call history might only be the part that survived the burning. Number at night, when the museums close. At night, when the museums close and the lights fade, I imagine those clay tablets breathing in the dark, each one holding the faint memory of a world we no longer recognize. We think we are the beginning of understanding. But maybe we are the last chapter of remembrance. And as the desert wind passes over the ruins of Uruk, carrying grains of ancient dust into another millennium, you can almost hear the first line of our forgotten story, soft, unfinished, waiting to be heard again. If the Sumerians were not the first, then who were they remembering? They said, kingship descended from heaven. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a statement of fact recorded in clay more than 4,000 years ago, a line that still trembles with something language struggles to contain. After the kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. It is the opening verse of what we now call the Sumerian king list, a chronicle of rulers, whose reign stretched far beyond the boundaries of human possibility. But before we can understand who those impossible kings were, we must first see what they left behind. Because the clay tablets are only part of the story. The cities themselves whisper just as loudly. The cities were not chaotic. The earliest Sumerian settlements, Eridu, Nippur, were not the chaotic sprawl of a people learning to live together. They were geometric, planned, aligned with intention that borders on the uncanny. When excavators first reached the foundations of Eridu, they expected disorder. What they found instead was layer upon layer of construction, each temple rebuilt directly on top of the last, stretching back nearly 8,000 years. The oldest structures were not crude experiments. They were already sophisticated, oriented to cardinal directions, built on raised platforms to honor celestial sight lines, surrounded by canals that flowed with engineered precision. The city of Ur, home to the famous ziggurat dedicated to the moon god Nana, reveals the same unsettling pattern. Its streets were laid out in grids. Its walls were massive, reinforced with bitumen and fired brick materials that required advanced kilns and knowledge of chemistry. Homes had drainage systems. Courtyards open to the sky in deliberate ratios. Even the placement of doorways followed astronomical orientations, as though the builders were mapping the heavens onto the earth itself. Nippur, the religious heart of Sumer, sat at the center of a network of cities arranged in distances that correspond to musical intervals and celestial cycles. Archaeologists have noted that the spacing between major Sumerian settlements reflects the same BASC-60 ratios used in their mathematics, as if the entire civilization had been composed rather than constructed. This wasn't accident. It was architecture that remembered something. And then there is the language itself. Sumerian stands alone in the history of human speech. It has no known relatives, no linguistic ancestors, no evolutionary trail leading backward into simpler forms. It appears in the archaeological record fully formed, complex, precise, and inexplicably isolated. Linguists have spent over a century trying to connect Sumerian to other language families. They've tested it against Indo-European, Semitic, Dravidian, even Uralic tongues. Nothing fits. It exists outside the tree of language entirely, as though it had been transplanted from somewhere or someone else. To write in Sumerian was to engage with a system that blended sound, symbol, and meaning in ways that feel almost encoded. Each cuneiform sign could represent a word, a syllable, or an idea depending on context. The grammar was agglutinative, building meaning through layered suffixes in patterns that required extraordinary linguistic sophistication. The Sumerians themselves believed their writing came from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge, whose name means she who counts the stars. They did not claim to invent it. They said it was given. And the more we study their tablets, the harder it becomes to argue otherwise, because the content of those tablets reveals something even stranger than the language itself, knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. Knowledge that shouldn't exist yet. One clay tablet discovered in the ruins of Nippur records the orbital cycle of Venus with stunning accuracy, 584 days, matching modern astronomical observations. Another tablet charts the movements of Jupiter and Saturn, tracking their positions across decades with precision that requires multi-generational record-keeping and mathematical models we associate with much later civilizations. Star maps etched into cylinder seals show constellations we still recognize today: the bull, the scorpion, the lion. But they also include celestial references that suggest the Sumerians were observing not just the visible sky, but cycles within cycles, precessional shifts that take thousands of years to complete. How could a first civilization track cosmic time on that scale? Number, and then there's the mathematics. The Sumerians used a BASC-60 numerical system, sexagesimal counting, which forms the invisible architecture of our modern world. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These aren't arbitrary, they're Sumerian. BASC-60 allows for elegant division. It has more factors than BASC-10, making it ideal for astronomy, geometry, and trade. But it's also a system that requires abstract thinking and understanding of fractions and ratios that most early cultures took centuries to develop. The Sumerians had it from the beginning. Tablets from the Old Babylonian period, successors to the Sumerians, reveal mathematical problems involving Pythagorean triples more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. They calculated square roots, solved quadratic equations, and understood geometric progressions. One tablet, known as Plumpton 322, lists number sets that imply trigonometric knowledge we didn't think existed until the Greeks. Yet there are sets, carved in clay, silent and patient. Number, the deeper the excavations went, the more the anomalies multiplied. Archaeologists unearthed evidence of advanced metallurgy, bronze alloys, that required precise temperature control, and knowledge of tin sourcing from distant trade networks. Tools that showed no evolutionary development, no trial and error phase, just sudden competence. They found medical texts describing surgical procedures, pharmacological recipes using dozens of plant compounds, and anatomical knowledge that suggests dissection and systematic observation. One tablet lists symptoms and treatments for over a dozen conditions, organized with clinical precision. And everywhere throughout the ruins, there was organization: bureaucratic records, tax receipts, property deeds, temple inventories, pair logs for workers. The kind of administrative complexity that requires not just literacy, but institutional memory, systems passed down and refined over generations. But where were those generations? Where was the awkward beginning? The fumbling first steps, the slow climb from stone to bronze to iron. The Sumerian record shows none of that. It begins already in motion, already sophisticated, already remembering. Number, the cities themselves seem to echo this. In Uruk, beneath the grand temples dedicated to Inanna and Anu, excavators found older structures. And beneath those, older still, each layer more refined than the one above it, as though civilization were contracting rather than expanding, growing smaller, simpler, more forgetful as it moved forward through time. It's the reverse of what we expect, and it aligns perfectly with what the Sumerians themselves wrote: that kingship, knowledge, and order descended from heaven. Whether they meant gods, teachers, or remnants of a forgotten people who survived some ancient catastrophe, their words point to one unmistakable idea. Sumer inherited civilization. It did not create a star. The clay doesn't lie. It remembers. And what it remembers is a world that came before, a world that built in straight lines, counted in 60s, tracked the stars across millennia, and left behind not ruins, but echoes. Echoes preserved in the geometry of cities, in the isolation of language, in the precision of mathematics, and in the unsettling sophistication of a people who appeared in history already awake. The question that haunts the silence between those clay tablets is not how the Sumerians achieved so much. It's who taught them to remember. Number, among the thousands of tablets, one document stands apart. Among the thousands of tablets scattered across museum collections and archaeological sites, one document stands apart. Not because it is larger or more ornate, but because of what it dares to claim. It is called the Sumerian King List, and it reads like a chronicle of impossibility. The tablet begins with a single line carved in the same wedge-pressed cuneiform used for grain tallies and trade receipts. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was an Eridu. What follows is a list of rulers' names, cities, reign length stretching backward through time until the numbers themselves break apart into something that no longer feels human. 8 kings are named, 8 rulers who governed the world before the flood. And their reigns are not measured in decades or even centuries. They are measured in tens of thousands of years. Alulim, the first king, reigned for 28,800 years. Lager, the second, for 36,000 years. And Meliana ruled for 43,200 years. On and on the list continues, each name paired with a city: Eridu, Batabir, Larak, Sippar, Sharapak, and each reign impossibly long, as though time itself operated under different laws. In total, these 8 pre-flood kings governed for 241,200 years. Then the tablet records a single abrupt sentence. Then the flood swept over. And after that line, everything changes. The reigns shrink. Mortality returns. The kings who followed the flood rule for hundreds of years, then decades, then lifespans recognizably human. The age of gods gives way to the age of men. The impossible becomes the historical. The mythic collapses into the mundane. But the transition is seamless. The king list does not distinguish between the 2 eras in Toner's style. It treats both with the same bureaucratic precision, as though recording not fantasy, but memory. Number this was not written as mythology. And that is what unsettles scholars most, because the Sumerian king list was not written as mythology. It was not a hymn or a prayer or a poem meant to inspire. It was a bureaucratic document, etched in the same cuneiform script used for tax records, temple inventories, and grain receipts. It was copied and recopied across centuries, with each scribe treating it as authoritative history. The cities named in the lists are real. Eridu, the first city, has been excavated. Its ruins stretch back nearly 8,000 years, layer upon layer of temples built and rebuilt in the same sacred spot. Shurapak, home to the flood heroes Isudra, has been confirmed. Larak and Sup are both real, both archaeologically verified. These were not imaginary places. They were the anchors of a civilization that kept records obsessively, that valued precision, that documented everything from the movement of stars to the wages of workers. So why would they list kings who ruled for 36,000 years? Different explanations. Some scholars dismiss the numbers outright, calling them exaggerations meant to grant divine legitimacy to later rulers. Others see them as scribal errors accumulated through centuries of copying. But neither explanation accounts for the consistency. Multiple versions of the king list survive from Nippur, from Larsa, from elsewhere. And while details vary, the structure remains the same: 8 kings, impossibly long reigns, then the flood, then mortality. It's too deliberate to be accident. And then there are those who notice the mathematics. The numbers in the king list are not random. They follow a pattern. Almost all of the pre-flood reigns are multiples of 3,600, a unit the Sumerians called the Sar. In their cosmology, the Sar represented not just a span of time, but a celestial cycle, the period it took for certain planetary alignments to return to their starting positions. Alulim's reign 28,800 years equals 8 Sar. Belager's reign 36,000 years equals 10 Sar. And Meluana's reign 43,200 years equals 12 Sar. The pattern repeats. The numbers are not lifespans. They are astronomical codes, epochs marked by the turning of the heavens, rather than the beating of human hearts. The scholars who see the king list through this lens, the pre-flood kings were not individuals. They were symbols, guardians of celestial ages, embodiments of planetary cycles, representatives of eras so vast that only the stars could measure them. Perhaps kingship descending from heaven was not metaphor at all, but a statement of cosmic order, a system where rulers were chosen not by lineage, but by alignment with the sky itself. But even this interpretation raises a question. Why would a bureaucratic culture encode astronomy into their royal lineage? Unless they believed the two were inseparable. Unless they saw time, kingship, and celestial motion as a single woven thread, one that had been severed by the flood and had to be remembered, preserved, passed down in clay, so it would never be forgotten again. Because to the Sumerians, the king list was not allegory. It was history. They believed these kings existed. They believed the reigns were real, even if the scale defied human comprehension. And they believed the flood that ended that age was not a story invented to explain suffering. It was a memory of an actual cataclysm, one so vast it reset the clock of civilization itself. The flood did not erase fantasy. It erased memory. And everything that followed, every city, every temple, every cuneiform mark pressed into wet clay, was an attempt to recover what had been lost. To rebuild not just civilization, but remembrance. The king list is a document of survival. The king list is a document of survival, a way of saying this is what we were. This is what we came from. This is what the flood took away. And perhaps that is why the numbers feel so wrong to us. Because they are not meant to measure time the way we do. They are meant to measure loss, the distance between what was and what remains. The gap between the age when knowledge descended from heaven and the age when humanity had to learn everything again, slowly, painfully, from fragments. When you hold that tension between the bureaucratic precision of the king list and the cosmic impossibility of its numbers, you begin to understand why the Sumerians copied it so carefully. Why they treated it as authoritative. Why they refused to edit the reigns into something more believable. Because to change the numbers would be to forget. And forgetting, to them, was the only true death. The flood had already taken one world. The clay tablets were their vow that it would not take the memory of that world as well. So the king list remains. So the king list remains pressed into clay, silent and patient, a record of 8 kings who ruled before the waters came. His name still carried the weight of eras we can no longer imagine, and his reigns mark the boundary between the world we know and the world that drowned. And just beyond that boundary, beneath the rising waters of the flood, lies the question that haunts every line of the king list. If these kings were real, what kind of world did they rule? The answer lies buried beneath 10 feet of silt. When archaeologists first reached the deeper layers. When archaeologists first reached the deeper layers of ancient Sumerian cities, they expected continuity, one civilization flowing into the next, layer upon layer of occupation, marking the slow passage of time. What they found instead was interruption. A sterile band of sediment, clean, uniform, devoid of pottery shards, ash, or human trace. Flood deposit. The excavation team led by Sir Leonard Woolley in the 1920s dug through the ruins of temples and homes until their shovels struck clay-thick water-laid clay that stretched down 8 feet before reaching the burned remnants of an older settlement beneath. Woolley stood in the trench and realized he was looking at the physical boundary between two worlds. Below the silt-charred walls, shattered pottery, the bones of a city that had ended in fire. Above the silt, new foundations, rebuilt temples, a civilization rising again from silence. The same pattern appeared as Shurapak, the city of Isudra, the flood hero. Beneath the ruins a layer of silt. And Akish, another band of sediment marking the same violent disruption. The dates varied slightly around 2900 BCE, but the message was unmistakable. Something had swept over the land. Number the Sumerian tablets describe it with stark simplicity. Then the flood swept over. No elaboration, no drama, just a single line dividing history into before and after. The age of gods and the age of men. The world of impossible reigns and the world of mortality. And that simplicity coming from a culture that recorded everything in exhaustive detail feels more like witness testimony than myth. Because the Sumerians did not write the flood as allegory. They wrote it as record, as memory, as the moment when the old world drowned and the new one began, smaller and more fragile, but determined to remember what had been lost. Number the oldest account. The oldest account comes from a tablet discovered in Nippur, written in Sumerian centuries before the Hebrew Bible. For 7 days and 7 nights, the flood swept over the land. The huge boat was tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters. The hero of this story is Isudra. His name means life of long days, or he who found life. In the Akkadian tradition, he is called Utnapishtim. In Hebrew texts Noah. But the structure remains constant across all tellings: a man warned by a god, a vessel built in secret, a deluge that erases the world, and a survival that preserves not just life, but knowledge. Number the warning. According to the tablets, Enki, the god of wisdom, keeper of the sacred me, the divine principles of civilization, came to Isudra in a dream, or perhaps through the wall of a reed hut, whispering so the other gods would not hear. The assembly of the gods, led by Enlil, had decided to end humanity. The noise of mortals had grown too great. The world had become unbalanced. The decree was final. But Enki could not bear to see knowledge perish with the people who carried it. So he warned Isudra. He instructed him to build a vessel, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard the seed of all living things, not just animals, but craftsmen, musicians, scribes, the keepers of memory, the bearers of the me. Abandon riches and seek life. Despise property and preserve the soul alive. Number when the rains came. When the rains came, they did not stop. The tablets say the storm raged for 7 days. The great boat was tossed upon waters so vast they covered the mountains. The world below, temples, cities, fields, everything vanished beneath the churning dark. And then silence. When the waters receded, Isudra released a dove, then a swallow, then a raven. The raven did not return. It had found land. The boat came to rest on a mountain, and Isudra made an offering of thanks. The gods smelled the smoke and descended, realizing too late that they had nearly erased their own creation. Enlil was furious that someone had survived. But Enki defended Isudra, saying that wisdom should not perish with the wicked. And so, as a compromise or perhaps as a burden, Isudra was granted immortality and sent to dwell in the land beyond the rivers, at the mouth of the rivers, a place where the divine and mortal worlds no longer touch. He became memory itself, the living testament to what had been lost. Number was this a story or the echo of a real survival? But here is the question that archaeology will not let rest: was this a story or the echo of a real survival? Because the geological record suggests something happened. Across Mesopotamia, layers of flood silt mark a sudden catastrophic inundation. Around the same period, the king lists places the deluge. Core samples from the Black Sea reveal a dramatic rise in water levels roughly 7,500 years ago, when meltwater from retreating glaciers broke through natural barriers and drowned vast coastal regions in a matter of weeks. The end of the last ice age around 12,000 to 10,000 years ago was not gradual. It was punctuated by violent climate shifts, glacial lake outbursts, and rapidly rising seas. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for millennia were submerged. River valleys became seas. Islands vanished. And humanity, scattered across those coasts, would have watched the waters rise. They would have fled inland. They would have carried what they could: tools, seeds, stories. And they would have remembered. Because a flood that erases your world is not something you forget. It becomes the dividing line in your history. The moment when everything changed. Number flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture. Flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture. The Epic of Gilgamesh. The Hebrew Genesis. Hindu Matsya Purana. Greek myth of Deucalion. Chinese legend of Gunyu. Mesoamerican tales of the fourth sun destroyed by water. How could civilizations separated by oceans and millennia all remember the same cataclysm? Perhaps because it wasn't one flood, but many local catastrophes caused by the same global climate shift, each one devastating enough to burn itself into collective memory. But perhaps, as some researchers suggest, there was a single massive event, a comet impact, a glacial collapse, a rupture so immense it reshaped coastlines worldwide, and became the flood that all cultures remember. Number the Sumerians believed the latter. The Sumerians believed the latter. They believed the flood was not local. It was total. It erased the old world, the world of the pre-flood kings, the world where knowledge descended from heaven, the world of impossible reigns and celestial order. And when the waters finally receded, what remained was silence. The gods withdrew. The kings became mortal. The cities had to be rebuilt from fragments. And the survivors, people like Sudra, were tasked with the most sacred duty imaginable: to remember. To carry forward the seed of all living things, yes, but also the seed of all knowing things, the mathematics, the star charts, the medicine, the language, the divine codes that once flowed freely from heaven to earth. Number that is why the Sumerian tablets feel so urgent. That is why the Sumerian tablets feel so urgent. Why the king list was copied and recopied across centuries. Why their cities were rebuilt on the ruins of older cities, each one an echo of what came before. Because they were not inventing civilization. They were restoring it. And the flood, the great silence that divided their history, was the reason why. Number after the silence came the teachers. After the silence came the teachers. When the floodwaters receded and the survivors emerged into a world made strange by absence, they were not alone. According to the tablets, there were beings who remained or returned to help humanity remember what had been lost. The Sumerians called them the Anunnaki. The name itself carries weight: those who from heaven to earth came, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but as a designation as precise as any lineage or title recorded in their bureaucratic texts. And what stands out immediately, what makes these figures different from the gods of later mythologies, is that they were not described as omnipotent. They were not distant, unknowable forces dwelling beyond mortal reach. They were participants, engineers, builders, lawgivers, teachers who walked among humanity and shared the knowledge needed to rebuild. The tablets described them with strange specificity. Enki, god of the deep waters and keeper of the me, taught humanity agriculture, irrigation, and the healing arts. He was the one who warned Sudra of the flood, but could not bear to see knowledge perish. His symbol was the serpent, representing wisdom and renewal, and his domain was Eridu, the first city, where the oldest temples in Mesopotamia still rise from the sand. Enlil, god of air and storms, governed law and order. He was the executive force among the gods, the one who decreed the flood, and later granted kingship to mortals. His temple at Nippur was considered the navel of the world, the place where heaven and earth connected. To rule without Enlil's blessing was to rule illegitimately. Anu, god of the highest heavens, was the father of the pantheon, distant but foundational. His name appears in star charts, and his temple in Uruk was aligned to celestial events. He represented the cosmic order itself, the framework within which all knowledge existed. And there were others: Ninhursag, the mother goddess who shaped life from clay. Inanna, goddess of love and war, whose journeys between heaven and the underworld became allegories for cyclical death and rebirth. Udu, the sun god, who brought light and justice. But here is what separates the Anunnaki from myth. They were not worshipped as abstract ideals. They were documented, their genealogies recorded, their cities named, their interactions with humanity preserved in exhaustive detail, as those scribes were chronicling history, not inventing legend. The most unsettling of these records describes the creation of humanity itself. The creation of humanity. In the text known as the Atrahasis epic, the gods grow weary of labor. They have built cities, dug canals, raised temples, but the work is endless. And so they conceive a solution to create beings who will carry the burden in their place. Enki and Ninhursag are tasked with the work. They take clay from the earth, the primordial mud of creation, and mix it with something else. The tablets say it was the blood of a god, a divine essence, sacrificed to give humanity intelligence and spirit. From the flesh of the god, let a spirit remain. Let it proclaim him as a living sign. Let the spirit remain so it is not forgotten. The clay is shaped. The divine blood is mixed in. And from that union, humanity is born, part earth, part heaven, mortal in body, but carrying within them a spark of the divine. To modern readers, this sounds like metaphor. But pause on the language: mixing essence, transferring spirit, creating beings from raw material and inherited code, clay and blood, body and blueprint. It reads less like poetry, and more like a description of genetic engineering, the intentional design of life, through the combination of two sources, one material, one informational. Scholars dismiss this as mythic symbolism. Scholars dismiss this as mythic symbolism, a way for ancient people to explain their own existence. But the Sumerians were not a culture given to vague allegory. They documented grain shipments and star positions with the same clinical precision they used to describe the gods. When they wrote that humanity was made from earth and divine essence, they may have been recording the only way they knew how, something they witnessed, or inherited memory of, but could not fully explain. A controversial interpretation. In the 1970s, researchers Acharya Sitchin proposed a controversial interpretation that the Anunnaki were not gods at all, but extraterrestrial visitors who came to Earth in search of resources, genetically engineered humanity as a labor force, and left behind the memory of their presence in our myths. Mainstream scholars rejected this reading almost universally. The evidence, they argued, did not support literal visitation. The Anunnaki were archetypes, anthropomorphized natural forces, celestial bodies personified, or deified ancestors whose achievements grew legendary over time. And yet, the descriptions linger. The Anunnaki were said to be radiant, winged, descending in flame, moving between heaven and earth in vessels the Sumerians could not name, but tried desperately to depict cylindrical objects, fiery chariots, skyboats that gleamed like lapis lazuli and bronze. Cylinder seals from Uruk show winged figures standing beside what appear to be celestial diagrams, planetary orbits, stellar alignments, geometric patterns that resemble nothing in the natural world, but everything in the realm of advanced astronomy. And these same descriptions, beings of light descending from the sky, teaching forbidden knowledge, appear across cultures separated by oceans and millennia. The Watchers of Hebrew tradition, the Devas of Hindu texts, the Viracocha of the Andes, the feathered serpent of Mesoamerica. How could such consistency emerge independently? Perhaps because they weren't independent. Perhaps because the memory of the Anunnaki or whoever they were was older than the flood. A memory carried by survivors who scattered to distant shores and rebuilt their civilizations in isolation, each one preserving fragments of the same original story. Perhaps. Or perhaps the Anunnaki were not visitors from the stars, but survivors of a pre-flood civilization and advanced culture that possessed knowledge we have only recently rediscovered, and who emerged from the cataclysm to teach the remnants of humanity how to begin again. A lost people whose technology seemed so far beyond the comprehension of flood survivors that they could only be described as gods. We may never know. But what the tablets make clear. What the Sumerians repeated across thousands of years of record-keeping is this. Civilization was not invented. It was given. Humanity did not stumble into agriculture, astronomy, writing, and law through trial and error. We were taught by beings who came from somewhere else, whether heaven, across the sea, or from the drowned world before the flood. The role of humanity, to the Sumerians, was not to create. It was to remember, to preserve the knowledge entrusted to us, to carry the divine codes of civilization, forward through time, so they would not be lost again. The Anunnaki withdrew. The Anunnaki gave humanity the tools, the laws, the language, the star charts, the architecture, and then, according to the tablets, they withdrew. Not entirely, but enough. The age of direct communion ended. The gods became distant. The kings became mortal. And humanity was left with the sacred task of maintaining what had been passed down, the inheritance of a forgotten world, encoded in clay, preserved in ritual, and whispered through the long silence of history. And so the question remains. Haunting every cuneiform mark pressed into wet clay. What kind of beings were the Anunnaki? And if they truly came from heaven to earth, where did they go when they left? But knowledge is not only preserved in stories. Sometimes it hides in formulas. Buried among the hymns to Inanna, the prayers to Enlil, and the epic tales of flood and creation, archaeologists found something unexpected: technical manuals. Documents with no mythic preamble, no indication of gods, just pure, distilled knowledge. Metallurgical formulas specifying cupertine ratios for bronze alloys. Architectural measurements using geometric proportions. Medical texts listing pharmaceutical compounds with dosage instructions. Agricultural schedules aligned to celestial events. Astronomical calculations of such precision that modern scientists had to double-check them with computer models before believing they were real. These were not the writings of a civilization learning through experimentation. They were the writings of a civilization remembering. One tablet discovered in the ruins of Nippur. Catalogued as VAT 4924, records the synodic cycle of Venus with perfect accuracy: 584 days. This is the time it takes for Venus to return to the same position relative to Earth, and the Sun a measurement that requires multi-generational observation, sophisticated mathematics, and instruments capable of tracking planetary motion with remarkable consistency. The ancient Greeks would not accurately chart Venus for another 2 millennia. European astronomers wouldn't confirm the cycle until the Renaissance, armed with telescopes and centuries of accumulated data. Yet here it was pressed into clay, precise and patient as though the Sumerians had simply copied it from an older source. Other tablets record the orbits of Jupiter, Saturn, and Mars. They track lunar phases, solar eclipses, and the precession of the equinoxes, a wobble in Earth's axis. That takes 25,920 years to complete a full cycle. To observe precession requires not just one lifetime of watching the stars, but generations upon generations of data passed down and meticulously preserved. How could the first civilization already possess this knowledge unless they were not the first? And then there is the mathematics. In the 1940s, archaeologists examining tablets from the old Babylonian period successors to the Sumerians found a clay fragment now known as Plumpton 322. At first glance, it appeared to be a list of numbers. But upon closer analysis, mathematicians realized it contained Pythagorean triple sets of three numbers that satisfied the equation a superscript 2 plus b superscript 2 equals c superscript 2. This was more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet wasn't teaching the concept. It was applying it, using it as a tool for solving complex geometric problems, calculating land measurements, and designing architectural angles. The knowledge was already embedded, already assumed, as though whoever carved those numbers had inherited a system so refined that they no longer needed to explain its origins. Another tablet describes the calculation of square roots, using an iterative method nearly identical to modern algorithms. Others show an understanding of exponential growth, compound interest, and geometric progressions concepts that wouldn't resurface in Western mathematics until the work of medieval Arab scholars and Renaissance Europeans. The Sumerians were not discovering these principles. They were using them as though the formulas had been handed down complete, waiting only to be applied. And it wasn't just abstract knowledge. The physical artifacts tell the same strange story. In the ruins of Ur and Eridu, excavators found bronze tools perfectly cast, alloyed with precise ratios of copper and tin, dated to periods that predate the so-called Bronze Age in the region. The transition from stone to bronze is supposed to represent centuries of incremental progress, slow refinement, trial and error. But the Sumerian bronze shows no such evolution. It appears suddenly already optimized, as though the knowledge of metallurgy had been transplanted rather than developed. Cylinder seals from Uruk depict what appear to be mechanical devices, wheels, gears, pulleys, objects that seem too advanced for their supposed technological context. Some seals show figures operating what look like looms or drills, machinery that implies an understanding of torque, leverage, and precision engineering. And then there is the object that refuses to fit any timeline at all. The Baghdad battery, discovered in 1936 near Kujatrabu, just outside Baghdad. The artifact consists of a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod components that, when filled with an acidic liquid like vinegar or wine, can generate a small electrical current. Dated to around 250 BC, it sits awkwardly in the Parthian period, a time when no one is supposed to have understood electrochemistry. Some researchers suggest it was used for electroplating gold onto jewelry. Others argue it was a ritual object with no functional purpose. But the design is unmistakable, a primitive battery, constructed 2,000 years before Alessandro Volta would invent the modern version in 1800. Could the Parthians have stumbled upon this by accident? Perhaps. But perhaps they, too, were inheriting fragments of knowledge that stretched back further than anyone wanted to admit. Because the site where the battery was found sits atop layers of older occupation, Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian. Each culture building on the ruins of the one before. Each one preserving echoes of what had been lost. The deeper you dig, the older the knowledge becomes. And the more it feels like inheritance rather than invention. The Sumerians had a word for this kind of knowledge. The Sumerians had a word for this kind of knowledge. It's often translated as divine decree or sacred ordinance. But the meaning is more precise than that. The Mi were not laws or rules. They were codes, principles, formulas embedded into the fabric of creation itself. Knowledge that governed not just human civilization, but the structure of reality. There were said to be over 100 Mi, each one representing a different aspect of existence: kingship, priesthood, music, metalwork, writing, warfare, justice, sexual love, decision-making. To possess the Mi was to possess the blueprint of civilization. And according to the myths, the Mi were not invented by mortals. They were kept by Enki in the depths of the Abzu, the primordial waters beneath the earth, and could only be passed to humanity through divine will or, occasionally, through clever theft. In one story. In one story, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu and tricks Enki into giving her the Mi while he is drunk. She loads them onto her boat and sails back to Uruk, bringing civilization with her. Enki, realizing what he's done, tries to retrieve them, but Inanna has already crossed the boundary. The knowledge is released. It's a strange myth, but it carries within it an older truth: knowledge is transferred, not created. It exists somewhere, in some original form, and civilizations rise or fall, based on their ability to access, preserve, and transmit it. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians were trying to tell us. Perhaps that is what the Sumerians were trying to tell us, that the science in their tablets, the astronomy, the mathematics, the metallurgy, was not the product of gradual discovery. It was the product of remembering, of recovering what the flood had nearly erased, of piecing together fragments of a system that had once been whole. The survivors of the deluge did not start from zero. They started from ruins. And within those ruins were inscriptions, tools, star charts, formulas enough to rebuild, if only they could remember what the symbols meant. Perhaps what we call progress is only this, the slow, painful process of remembering what we once knew. And perhaps the Sumerians, rising from the flood with clay still wet in their hands, understood this better than we ever will. That civilization is not built, it is restored. That science is not invented, it is recovered. And that every formula pressed into clay, every star chart aligned to the heavens, every bronze tool cast in fire, is not a triumph of human ingenuity, but a monument to survival, a way of saying this is what we saved. This is what the flood did not take. Star. Number, but there is one mystery deeper than the science. But there is one mystery deeper than the science, older than the cities, more inexplicable than the flood itself. The language. Star. Sumerian stands alone in the history of human speech. Not metaphorically alone, not poetically isolated, but linguistically orphaned, a tongue with no known relatives, no ancestral roots, no evolutionary trail leading backward into simpler forms. For over a century, linguists have tried to connect Sumerian to other language families. They've tested it against Indo-European, the vast family that includes English, Greek, Sanskrit, and Persian. Nothing. They've compared it to Semitic languages like Akkadian and Hebrew, which later dominated the same region. No match. They've searched for links to Dravidian tongues of India, Uralic languages of Central Asia, even Basque, and other linguistic isolate. Every attempt ends in silence. Sumerian does not fit. It exists outside the tree of language entirely, as though it had fallen from somewhere else, or risen from something much older. It appears in the archaeological record already fully formed. It appears in the archaeological record around 3500 BC already fully formed. Complex grammar, sophisticated vocabulary, a writing system so precise it could record poetry, law, medicine, and astronomy with equal clarity. There is no Proto-Sumerian, no transitional stage, no evidence of evolution. It simply is. And then, just as suddenly, it vanishes. By 2000 BC, Sumerian was no longer a spoken language. It survived only as a liturgical tongue, used in temples, preserved by scribes, studied the way Latin would be studied centuries later in medieval Europe, a dead language kept alive through ritual, because to forget it entirely would be to sever the last connection to the gods. But even in death, Sumerian continued to haunt the region. Akkadian scribes learned it. Babylonian priests recited it. Assyrian kings inscribed it on their monuments. For 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken, it remained the language of memory, the tongue in which the oldest truths were recorded. Because to the Sumerians, their language was not a human invention. Because to the Sumerians, their language was not a human invention. It was a gift. The tablets say that writing came from Nisaba, the goddess of knowledge, grain, and accounting. Her name means she who counts the stars, an epithet that links literacy with astronomy, record-keeping with celestial observation, as though language itself were a form of cosmic measurement. Nisaba was not the goddess of poets or storytellers. She was the goddess of scribes, those who preserved, calculated, and transmitted knowledge. To write in Sumerian was to participate in her sacred work. It was an act of preservation, not creation. And the writing system itself reflects that purpose. Cuneiform, from the Latin cuneus, meaning wedge, was not an alphabet in the modern sense. It was something older, more layered. Each sign could represent a sound, a word, or an entire concept depending on context. A single wedge-shaped mark could be a syllable in one text and a divine symbol in another. The signs were geometric triangles, lines, angles, shapes pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. And yet, within that geometry, something else was encoded. Some scholars have noted that Sumerian cuneiform signs often mirror natural forms. The sign for mountain looks like peaks. The sign for water resembles flowing waves. The sign for star is an asterisk radiating light. It was as though the script were not merely representing reality, but mirroring it, capturing the shape of things at the level of essence. To write in Sumerian was to perform an act of replication, an attempt to trap divine speech in clay, before it faded into silence. The Sumerians did not believe they were inventing language. They believed they were remembering it, recovering something that had been given to them from above, or from before. And there is evidence, strange and subtle. And there is evidence strange and subtle that suggests they might have been right. In the 1970s, linguists analyzing Sumerian hymns began noticing something unusual: mathematical ratios embedded in the structure of the verses. The number of syllables per line, the repetition of certain phonemes, the spacing of stressed and unstressed beats, all of it followed patterns that corresponded to harmonic intervals in music, not coincidentally, not approximately precisely. The hymns were composed using ratios like 23, 34, and 45, the same ratios that define musical consonants, the same intervals that the Sumerians used to tune their lyres and harps, the same proportions they embedded in their architecture and astronomical charts. It was as though language, music, and mathematics were not separate disciplines, but expressions of a single unified system, a code that governs sound, meaning, and number simultaneously. Some researchers have proposed that this reflects an ancient understanding of reality, as vibrational, that the Sumerians believed the universe itself was structured by harmonic principles, and that language was the human attempt to resonate with that structure. To speak correctly was to align oneself with the cosmic order. To write was to encode that alignment into clay. The word the Sumerians used for this kind of knowledge was me, the divine codes we encountered earlier. But me also carried connotations of sound, vibration, and utterance. The gods did not merely think creation into being. They spoke it. And the me were the words they used, the primal syllables that shaped reality. Number if that is true. If that is true, then Sumerian may not have been a language in the way we understand language today. It may have been something closer to a programming language, a syntax designed to interface with the fundamental structure of existence itself. And if the flood scattered humanity and divided tongues, as the later story of Babel would claim, then Sumerian may have been the last surviving fragment of the original language, the pre-flood tongue, the speech of the world before the waters came. Number there is a line in the Hebrew Bible. There is a line in the Hebrew Bible, in Genesis, that echoes this idea. And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech. Before the tower, before the scattering, before the confusion of tongues, one language. The Sumerians never called their language Sumerian. That is a modern designation. They called it Emiger, which translates roughly as the noble tongue, or the princely language, a name that suggests it was not merely functional, but elevated, sacred, set apart. Number and perhaps it was. And perhaps it was. Perhaps before the flood, there was a single language spoken by the pre-Diluvian kings, taught by the Anunnaki, encoded into the Maya language where sound, meaning, and mathematics were unified. A language that could describe not just objects and actions, but the relationships between things, the ratios that governed form, the vibrations that structured matter. And perhaps when the flood came and the old world drowned, that language was lost except for fragments preserved by survivors like Sutra, passed down through generations, carefully inscribed into clay, so it would not be forgotten entirely. Number by the time the Sumerians appear in history. By the time the Sumerians appear in history, the language is already ancient, already fragmented. They do not speak it fluently. They reconstruct it the way archaeologists reconstruct pottery from shards. They write it down obsessively because they know it is fading. They teach it in temple schools because they sense that to lose it completely would be to lose the last bridge to the world before. And they were right. When Sumerian finally died as a spoken language, something irretrievable was lost, a way of thinking, a way of encoding reality, a connection to the divine order that could never quite be recovered in any other tongue. Number the Greeks would later speak of the Logos. The Greeks would later speak of the Logos, the word, the reason, the ordering principle of the cosmos. The Hebrews would speak of the word of God, through which all things were made. But the Sumerians had known this first. They had known that language was not arbitrary, that it was not invented by humans fumbling toward communication. It was given descending from heaven, taught by Nisaba, encoded in the me, structured by the same ratios that govern the stars, the intervals of music, and the proportions of temples. Number and when we read their tablets now. And when we read their tablets now, silent, patient, waiting in museum glass, we are not just reading words. We are reading the last echoes of a unified code of creation, a language that once bridged heaven and earth. A tongue that the gods themselves have spoken. And if we listen closely enough between the wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5,000 years ago, we can almost hear it, still soft, geometric, singing in ratios we no longer understand. Number but language was not the only bridge. But language was not the only bridge. Long after the flood, long after the old world had been swallowed by water and silence, humanity tried to rebuild what had been lost not through words alone, but through stone. They built towers, massive tiered structures that rose from the plains of Mesopotamia like mountains that had no right to exist in that flat, endless landscape. The Sumerians called them ziggurats, from the Akkadian zikkuratu, meaning to build high. And they dotted the cities of Sumer like stairways frozen midicent. Ur had one. Uruk had one. Eridu, the first city, had one rising from the oldest sacred ground in Mesopotamia. But the greatest of them all, the one that would echo through history and myth for millennia, stood in Babylon. They called it a Temenenki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth. Number it was not a temple in the way we think of temples. It was not a place for worship alone. It was a structure of connection, an attempt to anchor the heavens to the earth, to create a physical point where the divine and mortal worlds could meet again. Because to the Sumerians, that connection had been severed. The flood had not only drowned the old world, it had broken the link between heaven and earth. The gods had withdrawn. The direct communion that once existed when knowledge descended freely, when kingship came from the sky, when the Anunnaki walked among mortals, had faded into memory. And so humanity built not out of pride, not out of defiance, out of longing. Number the ziggurats were not stairways to heaven. The ziggurats were not stairways to heaven, as later interpreters would claim. They were landing places for descent platforms constructed to invite the gods back down. Each level represented a celestial sphere, a layer of the cosmos. Each tier was painted a different color: black for Saturn, white for Jupiter, red for Mars, gold for the Sun, mirroring the visible planets as they appeared in the night sky. At the summit of each ziggurat was a small temple, a chamber open to the stars, furnished with a bed, a table, and offerings of food and drink. Not for priests. For gods. Star. In case they returned. In case they descended once more, as the tablets said they had before the flood, and found a place prepared for them. Number the structure itself was a map of the cosmos. The base represented the earthly realm, solid and square, aligned to the cardinal directions. Each ascending tier symbolized a higher heaven, a layer of reality closer to the divine source. And at the top, at the meeting point of earth and sky, was the sacred chamber, the Gugunu, the place where heaven touched ground. To stand at the base of a ziggurat and look up was to see the universe rendered in architecture. To climb it was to ascend through the layers of creation, moving from mortal earth toward the realm of the gods. But the climb was not meant for everyone. Only priests could ascend. Only those trained in the sacred rites, the hymns sung in the old tongue, the formulas that opened doorways between worlds. They would climb the external staircases 3 or 4 flights, rising along the outer walls carrying offerings, chanting prayers, performing rituals designed to call the gods back. But the gods did not come. Or if they did, they came rarely, quietly in dreams and visions, no longer in the radiant physical form the old tablets described. The age of direct communion was over. And the ziggurat, despite its grandeur, despite its precision, despite the thousands of laborers and decades of construction poured into its making, became a monument to absence, a structure that pointed towards something no longer there. Number Temenenki, the greatest of all ziggurats. The Temenenki, the greatest of all ziggurats, rose nearly 300 feet into the sky. 7 tiers, each one painted, each one aligned, each one encoded with astronomical and mythological meaning. It was visible for miles across the flat Babylonian plain, a man-made mountain in a land where no mountains existed. The Greek historian Herodotus visited it in the 5th century BC and described it in awe, calling it a tower of immense size, built in stages, with a spiral path ascending to the summit. He wrote that at the top was a temple with a great couch and a golden table, where, according to the priests, the god Marduk would descend and rest. But even in Herodotus's time, the ritual was ancient, a relic, a memory of something that had once been real, but was now only reenacted, performed in the hope that the old connection might somehow be restored. And then there is the story that would come later. And then there is the story that would come later, the one that would reframe Temenenki not as longing, but as hubris. The Tower of Babel. Star. In the Hebrew Bible, the story is brief. Humanity, speaking one language, gathers in the plain of Shinar and decides to build a tower that reaches to the heavens. God, seeing this, becomes alarmed. Behold, they are one people, and they have all one language. And this is only the beginning of what they will do. And nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. And so God confuses their language. Suddenly, the builders cannot understand one another. The work halts. The tower is abandoned. Humanity scatters across the earth, divided not just by distance, but by speech. The story is told as a cautionary tale. The story is told as a cautionary tale, a warning against pride, against the arrogance of trying to reach heaven through human effort. But that is not how the Sumerians told it. To them, the tower was not an act of defiance. It was an act of remembrance, a desperate attempt to rebuild what the flood had destroyed. Not just cities and temples, but the bridge itself, the connection between the mortal and divine, the link that had once allowed knowledge to descend freely, that had made humanity partners in creation, rather than servants abandoned in the ruins. The confusion of tongues was not punishment. The confusion of tongues was not punishment. It was tragedy. The loss of the unified language, perhaps the original Sumerian, the imager, the tongue that carried the me, was not a divine decree meant to humble mortals. It was the final severing, the moment when the last thread connecting humanity to the pre-flood world snapped. After Babel, there was no single language that could encode the divine ratios, no single tongue that resonated with the structure of the cosmos. There were only fragments, dialects, scattered words that once formed a whole, but now carried only pieces of meaning. And without that unified language, the tower could not be completed. Not because humans lacked the engineering skill they had built ziggurats for centuries, but because the tower's purpose was not architectural. It was communicative. It was meant to be a beacon, a signal, a point of resonance that would call the gods back. And without a language to encode that call, the structure was just stone, empty, silent, pointing toward a heaven that no longer answered. From that silence, history began. From that silence, history began. Not the history of the pre-flood world, where kings reigned for tens of thousands of years, and knowledge descended from above, but the history we recognize fragmented, divided, mortal. Nations speaking different tongues. Cultures isolated by language barriers. Civilizations rising and falling, each one trying to remember what had been lost, but no longer able to share that memory across the distances. The ziggurats remained, scattered across Mesopotamia, slowly eroding under wind and rain. The priests continued their rituals, climbing the tiers, laying out offerings, singing hymns in a dead language to gods who no longer descended. And the Temenenki, the house of the foundation of heaven and earth, stood silent in Babylon, its summit open to the stars, its chambers empty, its stairways leading nowhere. A monument not to human pride, but to human longing. A structure that tried desperately to remember what it was like when heaven and earth were not divided. When the gods walked below and mortals could hear their voices. When there was one language, one knowledge, one bridge connecting all things. But the bridge was broken. And all that remained were the towers reaching upward into silence, waiting for a descent that would never come. Number the desert wind passes over rock. The desert wind passes over rock in the hours before dawn, carrying dust that may have once been temples. From above, from satellite view, from the silent orbit of modern observation, Mesopotamia looks like a palimpsest, layers upon layers of civilization pressed into the earth. Each one faint. Each one waiting. The ruins of Europe barely rise above the sand. Eridu sleeps beneath excavation tarps. The ziggurat catches moonlight on its reconstructed tiers, a ghost of geometry in an empty plain. Number in museums across the world. In museums across the world, behind temperature-controlled glass, the clay tablets rest. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Each one a fragment of memory pressed into mud and baked hard by time. Cuneiform marks still visible, still legible, still whispering in a language no one speaks anymore. And somewhere in the silence between those marks, in the space between what was written and what was lost, a question hovers. What world existed before the flood? Number because everything we have followed points to the same conclusion. Because everything we have followed, every anomaly, every impossible number, every piece of inherited knowledge points to the same unsettling conclusion. The Sumerians were not the beginning. Star. They said so themselves. In clay, in stone, in the careful geometry of their cities, they called themselves the restorers of what was before, not the inventors. Not the pioneers. The restorers. Their language appeared fully formed with no ancestors to trace. Their mathematics arrived complete with ratios and formulas that would not be rediscovered for millennia. Their astronomy tracked cycles that required generational observation. Yet they possessed it from the start. Their cities rose geometrically aligned, architecturally sophisticated, as though someone had handed them a blueprint. And their own records, bureaucratic, precise, obsessively detailed, described a world before the flood. A world of impossible kings and divine teachers. A world where knowledge descended from heaven and humanity was taught, rather than left to fumble in darkness. Number if we take them at their word. If we take them at their word, if we read the tablets not as mythology, but as testimony, then the picture that emerges is not the birth of civilization. It is the twilight of an older one. And the flood, the great cataclysm that divides their history into before and after, was not the dawn of human progress. It was the moment when an earlier world drowned, and the survivors, clutching fragments of what had been lost, began the long, painful work of remembering. Number for centuries, scholars dismissed this as myth. For centuries, scholars dismissed this as myth, allegory, the primitive attempt of ancient people to explain their origins through stories of gods and floods. But then the evidence began to accumulate. Geological surveys across Mesopotamia revealed layers of flood silt, clean, sterile sediment deposited suddenly, separating burned cities from rebuilt ones. Core samples from the Black Sea showed a dramatic inundation roughly 7,500 years ago, when rising meltwater breached natural barriers and drowned vast coastal regions in a matter of weeks. Satellite scans and sonar mapping uncovered submerged ruins off the coasts of India, Japan, the Mediterranean, megalithic structures, stone circles, architectural remains resting beneath hundreds of feet of seawater, drowned when the ice age ended and the seas rose. And the timeline began to align. 12,000 to 10,000 years ago, the planet underwent catastrophic climate shifts. Glaciers collapsed. Sea levels rose by over 400 feet. Coastlines that had been home to human settlements for millennia vanished beneath the waves. If there were civilizations on those coasts, advanced, organized, possessing knowledge of astronomy and architecture, they would have been erased almost entirely. Only those who fled inland, who carried what they could, who remembered what had been lost, would have survived. And those survivors would have told stories. Stories of a great flood. Of a world that drowned. Of gods who once walked among mortals but withdrew after the waters came. Of knowledge that had to be preserved, encoded, passed down, so it would not vanish entirely. The Sumerians may have been the descendants of those survivors. The Sumerians may have been the descendants of those survivors. Not the first civilization, but the first rebuilders, the ones who took the fragments, the star charts, the mathematical formulas, the architectural principles, the sacred language, and pressed them into clay so they would endure, so the memory would not die. And if that is true, then everything we call the birth of civilization is actually the last echo of something far older. The pyramids of Egypt. The megaliths of Malta. The temples of Göbekli Tepe, 11,000 years old, predating Sumer, built by people who were supposed to be hunter-gatherers, yet somehow possessed the organization and skill to move stones weighing dozens of tons. These are not beginnings. They are endings, the final monumental efforts of a world that knew it was fading, that built in stone because stone would outlast memory, that encoded knowledge into geometry, because words would be forgotten. The Sumerians understood this. The Sumerians understood this. That is why they wrote so obsessively. Why they copied and recopied the king list, the flood story, the hymns to Nisaba. Why they built ziggurats as landing places for gods who no longer came. Why they preserved a dead language for 2,000 years after it stopped being spoken. Because they knew what it meant to lose everything. They had inherited the memory of that loss. The flood was not ancient history to them. It was living trauma, passed down through generations, encoded into their identity. They were the children of survivors, the keepers of fragments, the ones tasked with making sure the world before would not be entirely forgotten. And they succeeded. And they succeeded. For 5,000 years, their tablets have endured. Their cities, though buried, have been excavated. Their language, though dead, has been deciphered. Their star charts match our observations. Their mathematics inform our clocks. Their flood story echoes in every culture on Earth. They preserve the memory. But the warning embedded in that preservation is clear. Every age eventually forgets. Civilizations rise. They accumulate knowledge, build monuments, encode wisdom into systems they believe will last forever. And then through war, through catastrophe, through the slow erosion of time they fall. And the knowledge is lost. Not all of it, but enough. Enough that the next civilization has to start over, piecing together fragments, mistaking restoration for invention, calling progress what is really just remembrance. We are not immune to this cycle. Our own knowledge is fragile, stored in formats that decay, in systems that require maintenance, and languages and codes that future generations may not understand. If the power grids failed, if the satellites fell, if the servers went dark, how much would survive? What would we leave behind for those who came after? Perhaps clay tablets were wiser than we knew. Simple, durable, readable by anyone willing to learn, the shapes of technology of preservation that outlasted empires. The Sumerians were not primitive. They were survivors of something we are only beginning to understand. And their message, pressed into clay and buried beneath the ruins of ziggurats, is this. Remember. Remember that what you build can be lost. That knowledge is not permanent. That every flood, whether of water, fire, or time, resets the world. And only those who have encoded memory into something durable will have the chance to rebuild. The next flood is always coming. Perhaps it will be climate collapse. Perhaps nuclear war. Perhaps the slow forgetting that comes when civilizations grow too complex, too fragmented, too reliant on systems no one fully understands. But it will come. And when it does, the survivors, if there are survivors, will look back at our ruins the way we look back at Sumer. They will dig through our cities, decipher our languages, wonder how we knew so much, and why we did not listen. They will find our satellites full into Earth, our data centers silent, our monuments eroded. And if we are wise, they will also find something else. Something durable. Something encoded. Something that says, this is the restoration of what was before. Because in the end, that is all any civilization can do. Preserve what matters. Pass it forward. Trust that someone, somewhere, in some distant age, will find it and understand. The desert wind passes over rock in the hours before dawn, carrying dust that may have once been temples. And beneath that dust, beneath the ruins, beneath the flood-silt and the burned cities and the silent ziggurats, the memory waits, patient, geometric, pressed into clay, still whispering in the dark.